Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to switch things up a bit.
Sounds intriguing.
We're going to be diving into a realistic .NET Core developer job interview. Like, imagine you're right there in the room.
Ooh, I like where this is going. You know those documents with all the tough technical questions?
Exactly. We've got one of those with 10 questions, and our expert today is going to play both sides, both the interviewer and the applicant.
So it'll be like stepping into the shoes of both the person asking the questions and the one trying to nail the answers.
Precisely. And the best part, we're not just going to hear the back and forth. We're going to stop along the way, analyze each answer.
So it's like we're giving everyone a behind-the-scenes look at what makes a strong interview from both sides of the table.
Exactly. Whether you're preparing for your own interview or you're the one doing the hiring, this is going to be super insightful.
I'm ready to play both roles. Let's get this interview started.
All right, let's set the stage. Our expert is interviewing for a .NET Core developer role.
Okay, imagine a typical office, a bit of nervous energy in the air. All right, first question coming up. So let's talk about database versioning. How would you approach this in a .NET Core project, particularly when using Entity Framework Core?
Well, database versioning, that's crucial, especially when things move fast, With EF Core, my go-to is migrations. They give you a structured way to handle those database schema changes. So you define up migrations for the changes themselves and then down migrations to reverse them, just in case you need rollbacks.
Okay, hold on right there. I want to dissect that opening answer.
What do you think so far? Does it hit the mark?
I think it's a good start.
Yeah.
They mentioned EF Core, migrations, the whole up and down concept. Shows they're familiar with the basics.
Right. It's like those are the key words you'd want to hear in an interview for this kind of role.
But wouldn't it be better to, go a bit deeper, maybe talk about some real-world challenges with database versioning or some advanced techniques they've used? You're right. In a real interview, I definitely follow up with something like, can you tell me about a time you faced a tough challenge with migrations and how you tackled it?
Ah, that's good. It forces them to, show off their problem-solving skills, not just their knowledge.
Exactly. It separates those who've really been in the trenches from those who've just read about it in a book.
Okay, let's rewind and keep the interview going. What's the next question?
Okay, putting my HR hat back on, that's a good overview of migrations. Now, let's say you're working on a new feature and you need to test your database interactions, but you don't want to mess with the live data. What would you do? For that, I definitely use the EF Core in-memory database provider.
Ooh, I've heard of that.
It's really useful. Basically, it creates this lightweight database, all in memory, right? So it acts like a real database, but nothing gets saved permanently. Perfect for unit tests.
Ah, that makes sense. And they mentioned unit testing, so they clearly understand the importance of testing their code.
Exactly. And it shows they're thinking about writing testable code from the get-go. That's gold for any developer.
All right, back to the interview. HR, what's next?
Okay, so you've got the in-memory database provider. Now let's talk about the code-first approach. How would you go about customizing conventions in EF Core? Let's say you need to enforce specific naming conventions or relationships between your tables. Well, for customizing conventions, the Fluent API is my tool of choice. It's just so much more expressive and readable than using just attributes.
Okay, so they know about the Fluent API.
Yeah, it's like you can define everything, your table names, the data types for columns, relationships, even cascading behaviors. And it's all done in this fluent syntax that makes sense to a human.
Fluent API, check.
Hmm.
But could they have made this answer a bit more, memorable?
Definitely. Instead of just listing things the Fluent API can do, they could have given a concrete example. Like, I used the Fluent API to make sure all my table names are plural, so everything in the database is consistent.
Ah, I see what you mean. An example makes it real.
Exactly. It shows you've actually used it, not just read about it in the documentation.
Good point. All right, let's hear what HR throws at them next.
Okay, now let's shift gears a bit and think about performance. How familiar are you with DB context pooling? DB context pooling. Oh, that's super important for performance, especially if you're dealing with a high-traffic application.
I'm glad they mentioned that.
Yeah, because instead of creating and destroying these DB context instances every single time, for every request, you can reuse them from a pool. Saves a lot of overhead.
So faster responses, less resource usage, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And mentioning high-traffic applications, smart move. It shows they're thinking about scalability, which is Music to any interviewer's ears.
Okay, let's hear the next question in this .NET Core Marathon.
All right, next one up, DB context pooling, that's important stuff. But what about global query filters? Can you give me a real-world example of how you might use them?
Sure, global query filters are great when you need to apply some consistent logic to all queries for a particular entity. A common use case is soft delete.
Ah, I've used that before.
Instead of actually deleting records from your database, you just mark them as deleted using a flag.
So it's like sending them to the recycle bin, not completely wiping them out.
Exactly. And then with a global query filter, you can ensure that all your queries automatically exclude those soft deleted records. So you're maintaining data integrity without a ton of extra work.
Okay, I'm really liking how this interview is flowing. The applicant is giving clear, concise answers.
They're doing well, right?
They're demonstrating a good grasp of these concepts. What stands out to you about this particular response?
Well, they didn't hesitate to connect global query filters to a real-world example, that soft delete thing.
It makes it so much easier to understand.
Right. And by linking it to data integrity, it shows they're thinking beyond just making things work, they're considering the bigger picture.
Okay, let's keep this interview rolling. All right, here we go. So switching gears a bit, can you talk about the differences between tracking and no tracking queries in Entity Framework Core? When would you choose one over the other?
Okay, so tracking and no tracking queries, it all comes down to how EF Core manages those entities. Tracking queries are like keeping a detailed edit history. EF Core is watching for changes, making updates easy. No tracking queries, though, it's like you're just viewing a document. No edits needed.
Ah, so they're more efficient when you're just reading data.
Exactly. EF Core doesn't have to keep track of all those potential changes, so it's faster. So basically, do you need to change the data? That's how you choose.
Okay, they explain that really well. I like the analogy they used too.
Yeah, the analogy helps, but what's really key is that they clearly stated how to decide which type of query to use. That's what interviewers want to hear, that practical understanding.
All right, what's next on the list? Okay, moving on to the next challenge. Speaking of data modifications, let's talk about concurrency. How would you handle situations where you've got multiple users trying to update the same record at the same time, a classic concurrency issue?
Concurrency, that's a big one, especially in systems with lots of users. Thankfully, EF Core gives us concurrency tokens. Think of them like version stamps on your data. So if someone tries to update a record that's already been changed by someone else, EF Core sees that the concurrency token doesn't match, and boom, conflict detected. Prevents all sorts of data corruption headaches.
Okay, they clearly understand the problem and the solution. Concurrency tokens, check. But I'm curious, could they have gone a little deeper into the how?
For sure. They could have mentioned different ways to deal with concurrency conflicts, like optimistic concurrency where you retry if there's a clash, or pessimistic concurrency where you lock things down.
That would have shown a deeper level of knowledge.
Exactly. Diving a bit more into the implementation would definitely impress in an interview setting. Good point. All right, let's see what the next question brings.
Okay, let's dive into something a bit more specific. Let's say you're designing a database schema, right? And you've got these entities that are like conceptually part of another entity. Like think of an address. It belongs to a person. How would you model that kind of relationship in Entity Framework Core? It's a perfect example of when you'd use owned entities in EF Core. They're ideal for representing those objects that, depend on another entity, like that address being part of a person. You'd use the own as own method to set up that ownership in your model.
Okay, so they've got owned entities as the solution. But I'm curious, how does that actually work in the database itself? Would it be a separate table for the address, or would it be bundled with the person's information?
That's a really good question, and it's something a sharp interviewer would definitely ask to see if the applicant really understands how things work under the hood. By default, EF Core would just put those owned entity properties right in the same table as the owning entity. So in this case, the address fields would be in the person table.
So it's all together.
Right. But the cool thing is you can customize that. You can tell EF Core, hey, I want a separate table for this, if that makes more sense for your design.
So you've got options. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Exactly. Flexibility is key. All right, let's hear what our applicant tackles next. Good point about those storage options. Okay, let's switch gears again. Let's talk about data types. How do you handle situations where the data type you're using in your .NET Core code, it doesn't quite match the data type in the database itself? Like, for example, what if you need to store enums as strings? That's where value conversion in EF Core is a lifesaver. It's like having a translator, right? It helps you map between those different data types.
I like that, a translator. Makes it easy to visualize.
Yeah, so for enums, for example, you can tell EF Core, hey, store these as strings in the database, but in my code, I still want to work with them as enums.
So it's like you're speaking two different languages, but EF Core is handling the translation seamlessly.
Exactly, and that way, you don't have to worry about all those nitty-gritty conversion details yourself. EF Core takes care of it.
Okay, we're on the last question now. Let's see what they throw at our applicant this time.
All right, time for a bit of a curveball. We all know EF Core is great for, like, abstracting away those database interactions, making things easier. But are there ever times when you might say, you know what, I need to use some raw SQL queries in my .NET Core application?
Absolutely. EF Core is powerful, don't get me wrong, but there are those edge cases where raw SQL might be necessary or just more efficient. Like, let's say you've got this super complex query and EF Core's LINQ syntax just can't quite handle it gracefully.
I was wondering if this would come up.
Or maybe you need to use some specific database function, something EF Core doesn't directly support. In those cases, raw SQL gives you that flexibility.
So it's good to have that in your toolbox.
Exactly. And it shows the interviewer that you understand that sometimes you need to go beyond the framework. Think outside the box. All right, so our interview has come to an end. What are your overall thoughts on how our applicant did?
I think they did a fantastic job. They answered all the questions, confidently and clearly. They really showed they understand .NET Core and Entity Framework Core.
And they didn't just give textbook definitions, they provided real-world examples, insights. That's impressive.
Totally. And they came across as someone who can think on their feet, solve problems. That's what sets a candidate apart. It's not just about knowing the right answers. It's about showing that you can apply that knowledge.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
to all of you listening out there, getting ready for your own .NET Core interviews, pay attention. Don't just focus on the technical stuff. Show that you can think critically, solve those tricky problems, and communicate your ideas clearly.
And if you're the one doing the interviewing, remember, you're not just looking for someone who can parrot back definitions. You want someone who gets it, who's passionate about what they do, and who can think beyond the obvious solution. That's what makes a great .NET Core developer.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into a .NET Core developer job interview. Hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little bit fun. Remember, the key to acing any interview, tech or not, is preparation, clear communication, and that genuine enthusiasm.
And hey, who knows, maybe someday you'll be the one asking the questions in a .NET Core interview, armed with all the knowledge and insights you've gained from listening to the deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible with .NET Core.